Good evening, and welcome to another episode of Vulture's Rainbow Theatre. I am your host, Damon Vulture, and also, for this evening, your teller of tales, as I present a little concoction of my own, written in the style of one of the old masters of weird pulp fiction from the 1930s, Robert E. Howard. And now, douse the lights and listen to the curse of the Weaver. Summer was drawing to a close, and the incessant wind of the Goronian mark had a chill edge to it. Already the northern wind was blowing down from out of the nearby mountains of Goron into the tree-clad foothills, causing leaves and branches to whisper of the encroaching autumn and the time of harvest. On a morning of that pleasant season, an emperor's knight and his servant, who had been detailed to patrol the mark for the summer, could be seen riding their mounts up and down the narrow trails on the way toward the important village of Kesig, just within the mountains to the north. The black-haired knight, clad in grey mail and crimson tunic, was slender and tall. His servant, in contrast, was short and squat, dressed in plain brown garments and obviously losing what little hair he still had. Corlipo, for that was the title and name of the warrior, often played his battered lute and sang on such mornings as this, and so he did now, trusting his horse to stay to the rolling trail. Gesto, his servant, rode behind, sometimes adding his untrained voice to the singing of a familiar chorus. "That was a pretty tune, my lord. Would that you might sing it again," said Gesto. "Let me see, how did it go?" "Blessed be the lady fair, Vorko Miko Anna." "I think, dear servant, that your talent lies not in your voice," Lipo observed. Gesto nodded somewhat ruefully. "My lord, it is very truth. Singing is for gentlemen born, not for their servants." "Aye, think you so? You thought you were a pretty bird in that last village. You did sing passing well with a bit of beer to loosen your tongue." "Indeed, my lord, I remember little of the occasion, having been somewhat more fortified with ale than is my usual custom." "For shame, rude servant," the young man smilingly chided, not quite convincingly. "A servant of the emperor's court ought to comport himself with some measure of dignity." "So says my dear wife," Gesto agreed. "Especially when I come reeling home late of an evening. She teaches me dignity chiefly with the great skillet of her kitchen. Alas, her blows, though lovingly given, appear not to have had their desired effects on me. I must say that I am glad to be free of her instruction for the summer." "And do you, friend Gesto, sing for the good woman to calm her spirits?" "Not since she made it clear to me that my singing almost rivaled that of a braying jackass." Corlipo laughed again and began singing a few snatches of a ballad. Suddenly he stopped. "Look, Gesto, what is that?" Through the close-set pines the two men could just make out a house of wood atop the next hill. An open field near the house had been cleared of trees and stumps and was planted in grain waving brightly in the sunshine. After a moment's inspection of the little farm, Corlipo said, "Let us pay our respects to the good yeoman of this house, dear servant. I shall be glad to see the sun in that clearing after all these miles of shadow." Gesto nodded. "My lord, I only hope that he may have a good bit of something to sell us. Our packs are empty, and our bellies shall be before long." The yeoman, an older, rather stout man with a great yellow moustache and a shock of hair the same colour, sat on a stump with his eyes to the ground. He appeared quite out of sorts and distracted. The man did not move as the knight and his servant approached. Lipo cleared his throat. Is this the way a king's man is greeted, Master Forester? The old peasant looked up and then dropped to his knees in alarm. My lord, I didn't see you till you spoke just then. The man swallowed nervously. I do not let a king's call go by in disrespect, sir, but my mind was troubled by the matters. Your pardon, sire. Oh, he added, remembering the proper custom. Yeoman Luigi at your service, sir. Get up, Yeoman Luigi. We would stay in your house today. We have imperial good gold and can pay you for your trouble. The yeoman got up and bowed and then stumped off quickly toward his house. He shouted something at the open front door, and a woman, looking as unhappy as had the yeoman, came out and saw the visitors. Her expression changed, and dropping a bundle of rags she was carrying, she hurried out, falling breathlessly to her knees before the knight and his servant. My lord, she said with a forced smile, we bid you welcome. All that we have is thine. Excellent, Lady Forester, but we'll pay your husband good gold for what we take. Go now and make us a meal, and for it is hungry work this patrolling about and keeping order in the district. Yes, my lord. And my servant Gesto has a pack full of soiled garments. Get them washed before the sun is overhead. Now go. The yeoman's wife seemed as distracted and unhappy as Forester Luigi himself. She went off with a worried expression after giving her husband a sharp, pleading look. Lipo turned again to the yeoman. Sir Forester, have you any sons? Yes, sire. They be off hunting now, but not for long. Good. Have the youngest wash my horse. The eldest will help Gesto sharpen my sword and polish my armour. Agreed? It shall be as you say, good sir. Now, have you any daughters? I would be glad of fair company at table this evening. The peasant grew silent and looked at the ground. Sir, he said finally, I had one daughter, unmarried yet, but she has this last month been away from us. We fear that she is now dead. Not run away, is she? Exclaimed the knight. No, sir, taken. She was stolen from us. I would hear more of this. Gesto, take my horse and meet the lads as they come. Do you, Forester, lead us inside and let me hear the rest. The cottage was well lit, the sun coming through a great window to the east. There was a fire in the huge brick fireplace. Pots and farm implements hung on the walls. The ceiling was high, and off to one side Lipo could see a hayloft with a crude ladder leaned up against it. There were 2 beds with straw mattresses, and a gorgeous tapestry of peasant work hung on the west wall. Under it Lipo could see a large loom. The forester's wife and daughter must be weavers. He did seem rather prosperous for a yeoman. The forester led the knight to a crude wooden table and pulled up a bench for him. And now, Sir Forester, the rest, Lipo said, anxious to understand the situation. Well, sir, one day last month we was all out, my lads and me and the wife, and my daughter Chiosa, doing such things as should be done in summer when the weather's good and the corn's high. And there comes this big man a horseback, asking if he might stay the night with us, if he worked his keep. I said, yes, if he would bear a strong hand to the chores, the which he did heartily. But a quiet sort he was, not much with words. And later my oldest boy comes to me and says, I don't like him, Papa. This one is queer, and he keeps his eye on Chiosa when he can see her. I says, quiet he is, but he works for his keep and seems a decent sort. Still I had doubts of not wanting him sleeping on the floor where Chiosa and the wife and I sleep, and my lads as well. I put him up in the loft. Next morning when we woke up, the man was gone, and Chiosa was gone. Lipo considered this and nodded. And then, Sir Forester? Well, my lord, we was all of us in a state. We got to horse with such weapons as we have about the place, and followed the hoof prints of the stranger's horse till we were well into the mountains. That's when we knowed it. Knew what? Asked the knife. We knowed it was the fiend what got her. There's a fiend has a castle out in the mountains. We saw it with our own eyes, but everybody hereabouts has always known it was there. A fiend, Sir Forester. But yes, I have heard strange things about the High Goron and its fortresses. This will have to be looked into. Sir Cor, I would be obliged to your lordship if something could be done. We'd like our poor daughter back, the yeoman swallowed, if she be yet alive. This explains well your empty-headedness in the presence of an emperor's knight. My oath requires me to look into such matters as this. We can't have the king's dominions terrorized by monsters. Corlipo got up quickly and went to the door. Gesto, get the horses saddled again. We leave this very moment. But we just got here, my lord. We have unexpected work to do. Now be quick, and get our laundry back before the good woman takes it down to the river. An hour's ride brought Lipo and his servant within sight of the village of Keswick. It was situated in a narrow valley hemmed in by the lower mountains of the Goron. Wooden buildings hugged the steep grassy slopes of the mountain or filled up the narrow valley between. The spire and roof of the village's wooden kirk rose up above the tops of the lowest houses. Let us first find a mass priest and see what he can tell us, Gesto. I would not fight a devil without instruction from the god's holy clerk. My lord, I'm sure we can find one in yon holy place. My very thought. When they got to the kirk, they discovered that it was joined to an ancient monastery with crumbling plaster walls. When a novice sweeping the porch saw the emperor's knight approaching, he picked up his broom and ran inside. By the time Gesto had the horses tied in the courtyard between the kirk and the monastery, a grave-looking man with a shaven head and brown robes had come to the door. He bowed low. Good Sir Knight, I welcome you in the name of the Most High to the kirk of St. Isos. I am the abbot, Ascanio. Corlipo bent his knee before the abbot and touched the man's hand to his forehead. Holy Father, Corlipo gives you greeting in the name of his majesty. An emperor's call, and not even been to pay respect to the baron, I'll warrant. If my business were not so pressing, said Lipo, a bit sheepish at being caught in his violation of protocol, I would have shown my face to him ere now. Perhaps, Father, you may convey to him my apologies, and give him assurance of my goodwill. I shall, said the abbot. We'll not want the Baron of Keswick to think himself out of the royal favour. But come, gentle lord, what brings you to this poor kirk? I seek advice concerning a devil of the mountains. The abbot's eyes widened. A devil? That is not a matter for public speech in the open air. Follow me, sirs, and you will have counsel and refreshment in our library. Both are in short supply here, but such as there is, you may have. The three men entered the musty hall of the old priory, stopping just inside the door to kneel and to sign themselves before the sacred icons. Presently the abbot led them into a small library. Two narrow window slits cut into the old stone wall let in a thin trickle of noonday sun. In the middle of the room was an ancient wooden desk on which sat a single burning candle, the only other source of light. The novice with the broom came out from behind an old bookshelf where he had been sweeping, and bowed low. Dengo, lad, said the abbot, fetch us up a pitcher of beer from the cellar, and some of that cheese we received as a gift from Master Jelnick's house. Yes, abbot. Now, sirs, if you will seat yourself on those benches, we will have a chat. You were inquiring about a devil. Lipo nodded. An honest yeoman not many miles hence has reported his daughter stolen by this creature, or by his servant. Was it a big man on horseback took the child? So reports the forester, good father. Ah, said the abbot, that would be Blas. He has been in the service of this demon some 15 winters. He was stolen, so they say, from this village as a boy by the creature's former servant, a man who had himself disappeared from the village garrison some years before that. It would seem, good abbot, that this devil uses men as slaves till their uselessness come upon them. That is the way of it, Master Lipo. Perhaps Blas has reached the end of his time of service and is taking the fiend a new maidservant. Or it may be, the god prevent it, that Blas has taken him his next meal. How can this Blas do such things for a fiend? Alas, young lord, he cannot choose, for the monster has his mind in thrall. Blas is not master even of his own soul. It is said that the creature has a large grey beak with which he bites his victim, thus poisoning him with some wicked substance by which he gains command of his new slave and can speak with him wordlessly. And thus shall it be with that poor forest wench, if she not be made simply into demon's food. The devil's name? He is known hereabouts as Foroth. The local tellers of tales do say that Foroth is old, that beyond human years he is old. This by magic arts? I think not. The abbot frowned in the gloom and then turned glittering eyes on Lipo. In the mountains of Goron live foul monsters of diverse kinds. In the writings of the Holy Fathers, it is said that these were brought from the stars, on the ships of the ancient kings, before the fall of the great kingdom of antiquity. It is said that these devils did come from the planets above us, where lived others of their kinds. Poor Lipo exchanged looks with his servant. He turned again to the abbot. Father Ascanio, I ask you this with deep misgiving. What sort of devil be this Foroth? The abbot leaned over the scribe's desk toward Lipo. Sir Warrior, he whispered, no man has seen it who came back to speak with his own voice. It is whispered that... But no, I do not know and do not wish to report all that I have heard whispered. I will only say that the monster and its succession of slaves have been a terror to the local people as long as there has been an empire. Lipo considered this, frowning. But why hasn't the Baron taken his garrison up to this devil's nest and rooted him out? You must understand, said the abbot, smiling grimly. The people of the town, and the Baron himself, like their fathers before them, have grown up with the stories of the tale-tellers. The monster is horrible, but to them it is also an immortal deity of great power. They believe it may be one of the old gods of their ancestors from olden times. They live with the fiend as neighbour and try to ignore its depredations because they fear its power. And what do you think, Father Ascanio? You are an educated man. I think it is a creature of the outer spheres, and mortal, though it live long ages. It can perhaps be killed if one do it carefully, but I would warn you, friend knight, if it reach you with its beak, and that is all that I will tell you of its features, you will serve it as slave until your turn comes to die. Or you will be eaten at once. One cannot know the mind and intentions of this creature. After they had had further talk with the abbot, and that venerable man had promised to convey Lipo's apologies to the Baron, the novice brought in the refreshments. Ah, said Lipo, if we must do battle with devils, I'd as soon do it on a full stomach. Evening found the knight and his servant in a high pass of the mountains. The sun was low in the west, just fallen below the cold grey peaks. To the north, Lipo could see the great snowfields and indescribably high mountain tops, so faint and remote that almost he mistook them for clouds. The wind, blowing through the plunging valleys and treetops, set up a low and ominous wail. "If the abbot's directions be correct, there is Foroth's castle," Jesto whispered, pointing. In the orange light of late day, Lipo could see the huge ramparts of featureless stone. Its walls rose up out of the mountain top on which it was built, windowless and doorless. There were no bastions, no towers, only the grey square walls, ancient and wind-worn. A giant bird of the mountains gave out a plaintive cry. Jesto jumped. "Ah, dear sir, may the God forgive us our many sins. 'Tis a ghost we have heard, most like." "It is a bird, Jesto. Be quiet. You make my skin to be goose flesh with your whimperings." They dismounted. It was growing darker. As the mountains became black silhouettes, and then shadows against a purple sky, stars began to wink in the firmament. The planet Volcari shone violet just above the top of the evil fortress. A bad omen, this, for the violet planet was known to be a harbinger of death. "Jesto, we will huddle here against the cliffs tonight. Get our woolen cloaks, let's keep the horses close by." At first, Lipo saw Jesto and the horses as vague shapes in the gathering gloom, but within what seemed only a few beats of the heart, there was almost complete darkness. Nothing was visible but the stars, now strewn across the sky like white flowers spilled on black velvet. In the deep valleys, thousands of feet below the trail, the wind howled. "I have a plan," said Lipo. "In the morning, you return to town. Stay with the abbot and wait 4 days for my return. State your business to no one. If I'm not returned in that time, pay my respects to the Baron on behalf of His Majesty, and make it known that I am in danger, or dead." "Yes, my lord," Jesto replied. Although Lipo could not see him, he knew his servant was relieved to be able to go back to the village first thing in the morning. "You'll take my armor with you. My sword I'll keep concealed beneath this woolen cloak. I'll want my loot as well." "It shall be as you say, lord." The morning was cold. The incessant wind had a bite to it now, and poor Lipo could feel it even beneath his woolen cloak. He was now half waking, half climbing up to a steep path which led directly to the base of Foroth's castle. He knew that he had climbed upward to a considerable height, for most of the nearby mountain tops seemed just level with his eyes. The higher peaks rose in the distant north, faint and blue-white in the morning sun. At last, poor Lipo found himself standing on a ledge. The south wall of the castle was within arm's reach before him, and rose up grey and mighty against the clouds. Now he began playing his part. Like a foolish stranger would do, he began yelling. "Hello!" he called, hoping that the monster or his servant would not appear suddenly behind or beside him with intent to kill. "Hello!" Lipo kept this up for some time. At last a face appeared, looking down on him from the top of the wall. The face had long brown hair and a dark beard. It was twisted into a surly expression. That must be Blas, Lipo thought. "Who be you? And what do you want?" growled the large man. "My name is Lipo, late a minstrel and pickpocket of temporary residence in the fair town of Keswick, where I was not properly appreciated." "Keswick? What do you here?" "The Baron has his provost looking for me, and I thought I might be safer here in the mountains. "Kind sir, I have spent a most uncomfortable night in the cold, and am unfamiliar with these parts. Can you not take me in this day? I could do with a bit of food and warmth." "I have gold," Lipo added, shaking a small leather bag full of coins. The churlish Bloss seemed to grow suddenly more interested when he heard the sound of gold. "Wait," he said, and disappeared. A few seconds later, a harness on the end of a rope was lowered down over the wall. "Get in the harness, minstrel!" Lipo sensed the men probably had something underhanded planned for him when he got to the top. That was fine, for his own plans depended on Bloss's underhandedness. Getting in the harness, he adjusted the strap around his legs and chest and said, "Bring me up!" He felt himself being lifted from the ground. "Push out with your feet," the man called. Lipo did as he was told, literally walking up the wall as huge Bloss hauled him up hand over hand. He chose not to look below him, for that gave him a disturbing view of the tremendous height from which he would fall should the rope break. Instead, he looked straight ahead at his feet and the ancient stones of the wall itself. Much of the mortar had held these stones together was long since gone, having crumbled into powder, which in turn had been carried off by the strong winds. Lipo was surprised that the old wall should hold together at all. Suddenly he was at the top of the battlement. Just as suddenly the surly brute had a drawn sword to his throat. Bloss looked older than he ought to, drained of life. His eyes were wildly vacant, almost as though some other mind looked out through them. "The gold," he demanded. Lipo took the bag from his belt and reluctantly gave it to him. Bloss hauled him up over the bastion. Lipo saw that they were both standing in a square enclosure, paved with wide flags. The bulwarks formed the walls of the enclosure. Some yards off, and apparently positioned at the center of the courtyard, rose a low, squat building of black stone, every inch of which had been carven into stylized and hideous bas-reliefs. Blah grabbed Lipo roughly by the collar of his cloak and pressed his chilly iron sword against the throat of the young man. "You have saved me an errand, minstrel. There is someone who would like you very much." The big slave laughed softly and wickedly. "Walk carefully, minstrel." "I am under your instructions, sir." Bloss led him from the south side around to another side of the building. Some of the bas-reliefs were now close enough to see easily. Lipo could make no sense of them. Here was a picture of a multi-legged creature, rather like a spider, holding scepters in each hand. There was a picture of a star, with circles of varying size arranged about it. Words were carved beneath each circle, unreadable hieroglyphs. At another place, Lipo could make out a bas-relief in which men in strange clothes stood, apparently speaking to a whole group of the creatures. As he looked at the ancient and vaguely disturbing representation, Lipo could feel the hair on his back stand up, for he suspected that they were older than the Empire, older than the earliest memories of his own people, coming from the time when the dark and august king sailed among the stars in white ships and visited the worlds of the sky. Now they were on the north side of the structure. In the middle of the flagged walkway was a square opening. The morning sun served to illuminate the first few steps, but they went on downward into the opening, down into what seemed utter darkness. Bloss coaxed him roughly onto the stairs. Lipo found himself alone in a dungeon. When Bloss first thrust him in, he had been unable to see anything. He had only felt Bloss push him forward onto hay, and then heard a door latch behind him. But in time he noticed that a tiny bit of light was coming in through occasional gaps in the decayed mortar of the wall. He could see nothing through the cracks, but realized that he must be in a cell along one of the castle walls. Lipo was thankful that the big peasant had accepted him only as a foolish minstrel and thief, and had not thought to search him for a sword. He touched the tough leather scabbard hidden beneath his cloak, and felt reassured. Lipo realized that if he was going to find the girl and deal with the monster of the castle, he must quickly gain control of the situation. At the moment, armed or not, he was at the mercy of Foroth and of his servant, Blas. Most likely, Blas had put him in the cell as a future meal for the creature, or as a future slave. His cryptic remarks had certainly indicated nothing else. As his eyes became accustomed to the gloomy lighting, he could see that the cell was bare but for the old hay strewn about its flags, and a chamber pot in the corner. Could he use his sword to dig out the crumbling mortar in the wall and perhaps push a brick or two out? He winced at the thought of using his good sword for such work, but thanked the god that neither the devil nor his slovenly manservant had been conscious of the need for repairs around the old place. Lipo drew out his sword and began chipping away around a large stone whose mortar looked most decayed. Sparks flew off the stone as he chipped away. Occasionally he would stop and listen for footsteps in the outer corridor. By nightfall he had gotten the 2 stone blocks free of their mortar. He had only to push them out at the opportune time. His next move would be to try and find the girl. At the moment he heard footsteps in the corridor. Quickly hiding his sword beneath the hay, he threw himself into a corner and held his lute as though he had been plucking it distractedly for some time. The latch tripped and Blas's dour face appeared. He set a bowl of something on the floor. Then he did a thing which struck Lipo as odd. Blas looked at him intently and began moving his mouth as though he wanted to say something. It almost seemed as though some untouched corner of his diseased and eroded brain was trying to surface. Suddenly his eyes widened as though he remembered an extremely urgent matter he must attend to just then. He glared blackly at Lipo and shut the door. The knight could tell by his footsteps that Blas was hurrying back up the stairs. Lipo sensed it was time that he himself moved quickly. He began to push out the blocks he had loosened, finding it harder work than he'd expected. In time, however, he was rewarded by a blast of fresh night air and the sound of 2 stones tumbling down the mountain into the invisible gulfs below. A stream of light came in, projecting 2 shadows of Lipo against the opposite wall of his cell. One shadow was green and the other red. Looking out, he saw that the 2 moons had risen over Goron, the emerald Berdo and the crimson Roja, and that the surrounding mountain peaks were lit up in a riot of weird color. The next phase of his escape would be the most difficult. He remembered that the blocks of which the walls were made had wide gaps between them in many places. Yes, his fingers would fit in some of the cracks. He realized, however, that his boots would have to come off. Only bare toes would fit into those crevices. Better uncomfortable soles and stiff toes on freezing stone than warm feet and a fall to the death. Boots unlaced and removed, sword sheathed, he hauled himself out through the hole he had made by loosening and pushing out 2 large stones, and began searching gingerly for hand and footholds. Within a few minutes the hole was below him and he was hugging the cold face of the wall. Occasionally a strong wind would whip by from out of the northeast. Once a gust almost tore him from his position to carry him off into the night. Working slowly, not daring to stare downward into the gulfs below, he pulled himself up inch by inch. The moons were high by the time he hauled himself over the battlement and dropped, prone and gasping, onto the flagstones of the outer court. Lipo could see the hideous building again. Its black carvings caught the moon's light as a howling wind scored its depictions of demons and spider-like creatures from the forgotten past of his world. Off to the east, Lipo could see Volcari, the planet appearing as a large violet star just rising over a silhouetted peak. Perhaps, Lipo thought, that planet of death had come to watch for the night's demise. It was at that moment that a thin beam of blue light shot out from somewhere atop the roof of the demon-carved building, a beam of blue light aimed directly toward the violet planet. Lipo watched the slender line of light for several precious seconds, both frightened and fascinated. It took a great deal of effort for the adventurer to calm himself and turn to the business at hand. Just then, Lipo heard footsteps on the flagstone pavement. Blas? Lipo drew his sword, rushing at the same time to the shadowy west side of the building. He waited until Blas at last came into view, escorting with an iron grip on her arm a plump young peasant woman clad in a tattered dress and worn boots. "Back you go," he said, dragging the woman forward along with him. "By the day after tomorrow, you will finish it." The girl walked head down, stringy hair falling into her face. "The day after tomorrow," he said again as they walked right past poor Lipo. The knight stayed still, hoping he would be concealed in the shadows. They rounded the corner to the north side of the building. Lipo followed them, tiptoeing on frozen feet. When he peeked around the northwest corner of the building, he could see Blas's head disappear into the opening in the flagstone pavement, which led down under the open court to the dungeons. Waiting till they'd gotten to the bottom of the stairs and down the dark corridor below, Lipo followed quickly and quietly on cold bare feet, sword in hand. In the near-complete darkness of the corridor below, Lipo almost ran into Blas, returning from whence he had gone with the woman. Hiding himself in the doorway of an open cell, he watched Blas go by and heard him ascend the stairs. Once it was quiet, he sprang out and walked slowly down the dimly lit corridor, listening at each wooden cell door for the sound of the wench. Finally, when feeling one of the battered door with his fingers, he heard sniffing and a low moan as if someone within were crying. Well, he would do what he could. "Woman! St! Woman! Come to the door!" "What?" answered a weepy voice from inside. "Come to the door, wench, quickly." "Yes, who are you? What do you want?" "I am Cor Lipo, here to rescue you if I may." "A Cor!" she exclaimed. "An emperor's knight!" "Quieter, girl, there are ears about, and some, I suspect, are not human." "This I do know, Sir Knight. The gods save us both and give you blessing, good Sir Cor." "Now listen, Kyosa, I think I can break into your cell, but with the fiend and his slave running about, we'd not easily escape. We'll need to have a very carefully conceived plan. While I take a moment to rest and calm my mind, you must offer such help as you can. Tell me about yourself, but whisper, so that we are not overheard." "I am the daughter of a poor forester and a weaver, like my mother. I make or used to make tapestries and rich fabrics for the baron and for such people in the barony that could afford them. And when the wicked man brought me here, Blas, he brought me to this castle, and I am terrible afraid, Sir Knight. Blas says to me when he brought me to this place, he says, 'Weave a picture with spiders in it,' and he put me in a room upstairs in that house with the spiders all over its walls. A horrible room it is, sir, all covered with cobwebs, and it's very dark. And all the inside walls has pictures of spiders. Some of the pictures are old tapestries, like the ones I make. Blas told me his master likes them. He wouldn't say why." "Have you seen the fiend, his master?" Lipo asked. "No," she replied. There was a long silence. "No, I've not seen it, sir, but I've heard the breathing behind the door." "I don't understand." "It's in a room next to that chamber, sir, where I weave. There's something in there what breathes and rattles like an old man on his deathbed.
Blas says that it's the master. I thank the God I have not seen it." Her voice broke. She stopped speaking for a moment and began again. "Good sir, I'm terrible scared. I know what the monster feeds on." Lipo could hear the rising panic in the girl's voice and decided to divert her attention, to get her to talk about something which suddenly seemed not just odd, but possibly very important to him. "Now listen, Kjosa, I want us to forget about your master for a while and talk a little more about Blas. I saw Blas twice today. The first time we met at my capture, his face was a mask through which other eyes gazed, eyes that were not his own. This evening he brought food to me in my cell and seemed almost a normal man. Have you seen him behave so?" Lipo heard the girl stir suddenly. "Why, yes," she whispered excitedly. "Every night at the same time when I am through with the day's work, Blas gets up from where he sits in a shadowy corner and comes to my loom. He speaks meanly to me, as always, but more softly then, and his eye is on the door to the room where the thing lives, and he says, 'This is no good, change that,' and he rips out half of my day's work. It's like he wanted me to keep working and not ever to get through. Like he wants me to live longer, but then he comes out of it and starts saying mean things. He says, 'Here, what's this? Dawdling? I'll teach you not to do your work.' And sometimes then he hits me or slaps my face." Lipo leaned against the wall, staring into the gloom of the dimly lit corridor. He could see that there was some strong bond between the mind of Blas and whatever it was behind that upstairs room. What could it mean if the bond seemed to relinquish its hold at regular times every day and night? Was the demon Foroth so occupied at certain points that it must shift its attention away from the human slave? Whatever the situation, Lipo felt that those moments of limited freedom for Blas might be the time to attempt something. Better to deal with a distracted devil than with a devil seeing through both its own eyes and those of its slave. "All right then, Kjosa. I have the beginnings of a plan to rescue you, but you must spend the rest of this night in your cell and go to work with Blas, as you have been doing all along. Tomorrow you will go and weave in the chamber next to that of the monster. Tomorrow night you shall return to your cell. I will come to you shortly after midnight, so the god me help. Understood? And not a word of this to Blas." "No, sir warrior. Look for me after midnight." When Lipo finally made the harrowing climb back down the wall and through the hole into his cell, it was dawn. He pinned his cloak over the opening, using bits of rock and mortar from the work he'd done with his sword to remove the stones. He now possessed a coil of rope cut from the large coil used to haul the harness he'd ridden up the south wall. He fastened it to a metal boot scraper deeply rooted and fastened into the flagstone pavement, and threw the rest of its length over the parapet to hang by the hole in his cell. The plan would depend upon Blas not venturing to the southern wall of the castle for the next day. Given that he come slowly and unwillingly to that side when Lipo had called for him, he felt fairly confident that the rope would hang unnoticed until nightfall. That evening, after dark, Blas opened the cell and shoved a bowl of swill across the floor toward Lipo. "Play where you can, minstrel," he quipped, and then locked the door. The comment served to confirm to Lipo that Blas soon planned to feed him to the creature upstairs. Lipo was glad that the moons would rise later tonight than they had the previous evening. His cloak would not have kept out so much moonlight, and Blas would have suspected something amiss in the dungeon had he seen the lurid glow leaking around the edges of the cloak into what should have been a dark cell. Once he knew Blas was gone from the corridor, Lipo went to work. He pulled the cloak away from the hole. It was quite dark but for the stars and hint of red and green light to the east beyond the mountains. He wrapped the coil of rope around his waist, buckled on his sword, and climbed out of the opening, grabbing the rope, trusting to the iron boot scraper above and his own knots. This time the climb went more quickly and the wind was down. By the time he reached the battlement, the moons were just coming up between the mountains. The violet planet Volcari, a point of bright purple light, and a star auguring death rose to shine midway toward its zenith. Hiding in the spider-carved building's western shadows, he waited. Just as it had done the previous night, a blue beam of silent light shot out from some point atop the building, aimed directly toward Volkari. Once again, meanwhile, Lipo saw Blas bring the woman around the southwest corner. It seemed to Lipo that the appearance of the beam of light and Blas's lapses of obedience were definitely related. Apparently, Lipo concluded, when the creature focused his mind on these blue-lighted transmissions to his home planet, his attention toward Blas lapsed, leaving the slave some minute control over his own will, if only momentarily. Lipo now stood in the shadows listening as they swiftly walked by.
"The work is bad, woman, but I tear out only a little stitches. Now it must be done, and by this time tomorrow, Master will have his pretty picture, and tomorrow he will have you."
Blas laughed, but then looked sad. He paused with her there in the lurid moonlit night and whispered to her,
"I kept you alive, but no more."
He led the woman around to the north side of the building. Poor Lipo knew he had but a short time to carry out his plan successfully. He rushed around to the building's southern entrance. Looking up, he saw that Volkari was almost at zenith. The demon would have exhausted his power to transmit by then and might well fall asleep. He hoped he had guessed well. He quietly opened the wooden door of the entrance. Once inside, he saw that he was in a square, richly furnished chamber lit crimson by lights that were not flames, not candles, but fat, round orbs of some kind. In the red light, he could see that the walls were hung with rich curtains and tapestries, all of which trailed a thin grey film of webbing. They all appeared to be peasant work like that of Kyosa's, and some of them were so old he knew without doubt that to touch them was to see them fall to dust. But the motifs they uniformly carried were most disturbing. All of the tapestries, from Kyosa's newest to the very oldest, depicted spider-like creatures clad in armor or clothing, some of them gripping in their hooked claws various objects, some of which appeared to be of sacred import and others which appeared to be made for the purpose of combat. Lipo could also see a loom to his right, a large, ancient, well-made loom which must have been purchased and assembled in the distant past, and which was kept in working order for the succession of talented maidens who had been pressed into service for such hideous work. Kyosa's tapestry in progress hung upon it now, a beautifully done piece of sheer ugliness, covered with perfectly rendered arachnids. The thing was now nearly complete, with only a few of its strands pulled out into loops, and it hung upon the device, the only clean work in the chamber without a covering of grey web. Lipo hurried on, now finding himself deeper into the chamber. In the wall opposite from the entrance he found yet another plain wooden door. After putting his ear to it and hearing no sounds of movement from within, he opened it slowly, thanking the god that the ancient wooden portal did not creak on its hinges. The room beyond the door was a tangled maze of thick grey webbing. A blue glow came from within, what looked like a wide translucent pillar made also of webbing, standing from floor to ceiling there in the center of the chamber. There was a shadow of something squat and round inside that pillar. When Lipo heard the rhythmic hissing sounds of its respiration, the hair stood up on the back of his neck. The fiend could wake at any moment, if indeed it were asleep and not simply waiting for him to come within striking distance. He could feel himself sweating profusely beneath his clothes. Sidling around the room, tearing holes in the webbing to open a path along the wall, staying away from that glowing pillar, he worked at last into a position where he could see a clear opening in the vertical webbed construction of the cylinder. What he saw made him understand what he was facing in a way he had not before. He was looking upon a being whose fathers had come to this world in the remotest ages of its history, brought here during the legendary, mythical days of the Star Kings, when humankind sailed the air and the remote reaches of space in ships. What he saw inside its cylindrical bower was an enormous round creature covered with black fur. Its 8 legs were folded intricately about it. A glowing bluish sphere showed that it had a multitude of glittering round black eyes in the region of its head. Below this battery of eyes was a horrible grey beak, sharp and pointed like that of a carrion bird. The thing was not aware of Core Lipo. Its eyes were engaged with the blue communication sphere, which from time to time became bright enough to illuminate the whole room. Core Lipo was nearly frozen with fear, but he knew he must keep mastery of his emotions until the job was done. Kill the devil Foroth, and then it would be short work to slay Blas and take the woman. He raised his sword to strike. Now. At that moment, the creature sprang to life, the legs coming out of their intricate interwoven folds faster than Lipo would have imagined possible. It stood facing him now, its baleful array of eyes fixed on him. The susurrations of its hissing trachea and the clicking of its lethally sharp beak made Lipo quail and pause when he should have plunged his sword into the head of the thing. Now Lipo was frantic. The creature, through whatever bond he had with Blas, would have his servant up here in a short time. The thing leaped out of its nest, landing off to Lipo's left. He thrust at it with the sword and it backed off. It began trying to work its way out beyond Lipo's peripheral vision, where it could, jump on him without getting riven by the sword? Yes, he turned as it scuttled to the left, keeping it before his eyes. The beak, and perhaps the claws or hooks at the ends of its legs, must certainly be poisonous. He thrust at it again. It backed away. It lunged toward him and then fainted away. Then Lipo looked up, for a voice shouted, "No!" What happened next was never entirely clear to the Emperor's Knight, for he was somewhat blinded by the bright blue light from the sphere, and things happened too quickly. First, he turned to meet Blas, swinging his sword overhead in a standard defensive maneuver he had been drilled in as a squire. There was a rush of air by his ear, and something hot and liquescent spat at him. Blas met him sword to sword, and the fight was on. The two parried strokes for a bit, and Core Lipo could see that the man was, surprisingly, a good swordsman for a peasant. Perhaps he had originally been a soldier instead. The two fought back and forth in the room, cutting enormous swaths in the webbing which impeded their movements. This often hindered them, the webbing clinging to their arms and torsos and getting in their eyes. This gave Lipo an idea. He maneuvered the big man until his back was against the great webbed cylinder in mid-chamber. Lunging forward, Lipo caused Blas to fall over backwards into the webbing and get entangled in it. Lipo moved in and with a mighty stroke smashed the glowing blue globe, his swing also catching the servant's shoulder, severing his arm from the body. Blas died instantly. At first it was too dark to see, but eventually Lipo could make out that the chamber door was open. He could see the dim and lurid glow from the red spheres in the next room. He stumbled out into the outer chamber, sword in hand. The monster was gone, having left the entrance door open and a glistening ribbon of smoking ichor to mark its path of escape. Apparently, Lipo had dealt the creature a wound after all, however shallow, given its swiftness and evasion, and now the knight had a trail to follow. He ran, following the line of fluid around the west side of the spider-carven building of the northern entrance to the dungeons. There was a stream of muck going back down and one coming back out around the east side of the building. He followed the trail, which was quite easy to see in the glowing green and red lights of the two moons, now full and overhead. The east side of the structure and the flagged pavement before it were caught in this double fall of moonlight. In the weird glare of the night, Lipo saw the creature perched on the flags, besmirched with filth and fluids from his own ruptured body. Lipo rushed at the screaming devil, sword out, gripped in both hands for a fell stroke. A foot or two from the monster, he started to swing, only to find arms restraining his own from behind. The woman had not stayed in her cell, but had been fetched from it by her arachnid master, and now she seemed to have acquired a strength not her own. Foroth had got control of the girl as he had of Blas. Lipo's arms were now pulled to his sides by hands possessing superhuman strength. He still gripped the sword, but could not swing it. The creature rose up on the lip of the battlement, gripping its stones with its multiple legs, its juices trickling out of it onto the stones. Its grey beak opened and shutting with a snap, the multitude of its eyes gleaming in the moonlight, some red as coals, and some viridian as emeralds, and its breath hissed and sucked wetly within it. The beak came within a foot of Lipo's throat. Snap! Within an inch! Lipo closed his eyes in resignation. Death for him was imminent. But then he heard a moan escape from the creature. The thing began to totter backwards against the battlement and then fell over the stones of the wall to its death in the plunging darkness below the castle. The Baron of Keswick, though a local official of modest wealth, sponsored a magnificent celebration in honour of the recent events which had brought such joy to his subjects. In the lofty banquet hall, his nobles, the court officials, and officers from the imperial garrison ate and drank with much laughter and merriment. Some village fiddlers and an old wheelwright who played the bagpipes had been called in, and these played raucous jigs and reels for those who desired to leap from their benches and prance ridiculously about with comrades or serving women. Poor Lipo shouted to the Baron over the din. "A worthy feast, my noble lord!" "Ah, 'tis but a token, good sir knight, of my esteem and eternal gratitude, which reminds me." The Baron, an immense man with a large belly and overly generous mustachios, rose up from the table. He held up his full stein of beer in a sign that the noise should cease. In a few moments the music stopped, and the dancers and other revellers stood quietly, if rather breathlessly, in expectation of what the Baron might say. Soon all noise had ceased. "Lords and ladies, captains of the imperial garrison, officers of the court, subjects all, the god has blessed us this year, as in most years, with good malt and barley, with fat cows and bulls, with plenty of ale and mead, with cheese, with warm houses, and with the continued blessings of law and order. For these things we do make humble thanks unto the god, and unto our own patron, the blessed Saint Isos, who lives in the light of the presence forever." "Oon, oon," whispered the Baron's subjects, the customary response to such invocations as these. "And now, in the name of the blessed, I give you Cor Lipo, Knight of his Imperial Majesty, and the one who drove the wicked shadow from our mountains. Here!" He raised his glass still higher, and the people raised theirs in response. Turning to face the knight, the Baron said, "Noble sir, we drink your health." All drank with him. After the banquet was over and Lipo was climbing the stairs to the castle chamber prepared for his use, he discovered that Gesto was behind him carrying a sack full of bread he had quietly removed from the tables to help feed them on the road. "Master Lipo?" "Yes, Gesto." "I do think the Baron is quite forgiven your discourtesy in not paying respects when you came to town." "I have you and the good abbot to thank for that. Did you worry about me?" "Worry, sir? I had you marked for dead right off, I did, sir. Oh, you've no idea the joy I felt when you came into the village, filthy and sticky, and the peasant woman with you alive and all." "It took most of a morning to get her out of her stupor. She'll never know what came to pass that night." "I pray the gods she does not, for how should she sleep, sir?" "Aye, but I remember it well. How shall I then sleep?" Gesto produced a sealed pitcher of beer from the bread sack. "Drink this, sir, and you'll not want for sleep." "I have had my fill of that tonight, gentle servant. Do you drink it in my stead." "That I shall do, to your good health, of course, sir." "Of course. Well, I'm off to bed. We leave with the dawn to the city of Brust, and a return to the imperial palace. Over 3 months' time is nearly gone, and the emperor will desire our presence at Holy Feast, the end of this month. And my wife and brat shall want me at home for wintertide. Good night to you, sir." I hope you have enjoyed tonight's selection, and I look forward to our next drop, when another new author, Tony Stregonona, will treat us to a bit of dark science fiction that should freeze your blood. This has been Damon Vulture, wishing you a good night and dark dreams.